He came to the skyscraper just to mop floors, dreaming only of feeding his son. But within a week, the millionaire CEO asked him, "Would you marry me?" And his life turned upside down. The day Ethan Moore signed the janitor's contract felt like swallowing a stone. 31 years old, once full of dreams of running his own business, he now stood in the shadow of a towering glass skyscraper that gleamed like a monument to other people's success. His shirt was ironed, but the cuffs were worn. His shoes were polished, though the soles carried the memory of too many miles walked in search of steady work. In his pocket, folded neatly, was a drawing his 6-year-old son, Jake, had made that morning. Two stick figures holding hands, a shaky scrawl that read, "Me plus Dad." Ethan touched it through the fabric, needing the reminder of why he was here. Inside the lobby, the air was cold, conditioned, smelling faintly of coffee and money. Businessmen in pressed suits moved with the ease of people who never worried about bills, their briefcases gleaming, their shoes clicking across marble floors. Ethan carried only a small duffel with cleaning supplies and a badge clipped awkwardly to his shirt. The receptionist barely glanced at him as she directed him to the maintenance office. He was invisible, a shadow meant to keep the floors shining and the trash bins empty. His supervisor, a thick-set man with a tired face, handed him a cart. "You start on the 15th floor," he said, not unkindly but without ceremony. "Quiet work, empty the bins, mop the halls, clean the windows in the smaller conference rooms. Don't touch the boardroom unless you're asked, and stay out of the way." Ethan nodded, wheeled his cart into the service elevator, and pressed the button. As the lift climbed, he felt every hum and shudder in his bones. Each floor they passed felt like another reminder of how far he was from the life he wanted for Jake. When the doors opened, he stepped into a world of sleek glass walls and polished steel desks. Employees in tailored clothes typed quickly on laptops, speaking in clipped, efficient tones. Their lives seemed wrapped in an urgency he didn't share. To them, he was only the man pushing a cart, the one to be avoided with polite silence. Ethan kept his head down, emptying wastebaskets, spraying down counters, his movements practiced, efficient. He had learned long ago that dignity wasn't in the title of the job, but in how you carried it out. He scrubbed the floors with the same care he once used to fix engines, reminding himself that Jake needed rent paid and food on the table more than he needed his father's pride. But as the evening stretched into night and the floor grew quieter, Ethan found himself humming softly, an old habit from years of working with his hands. He was crouched by the glass wall of a small meeting room, wiping away smudges when he felt it, the prickle of being watched. He turned his head and froze. Across the hall, a woman stood by the corner office. Her presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore. She wore a tailored white suit that seemed to glow under the overhead lights, her blonde hair pulled back into a precise knot, her posture as straight as a blade. She wasn't just beautiful. She radiated authority, the kind of confidence that silenced a room without a word. Her eyes, warm brown yet sharp with calculation, were fixed on him. For a moment, Ethan forgot to breathe. He expected disdain, the usual dismissive glance from someone in her world to someone in his. Instead, she simply watched, her expression unreadable. He broke eye contact quickly, focusing on his rag, scrubbing harder than necessary. She walked away without a word, her heels clicking like a metronome down the corridor. But the weight of her gaze lingered. Later, when he stepped into the break room to wash his hands, he caught sight of her again through the glass wall of the main boardroom. She stood at the head of a long table, speaking with quiet authority to a group of executives twice her age. They leaned in as she spoke, nodding, taking notes. Ethan realized with a start who she must be. Not just an employee, not just a manager. The leader. Her name, he would later learn, was Ava Clark, CEO, billionaire, untouchable. But in that moment, as he rolled his cart past the glass and she glanced at him briefly, just a flicker of attention amidst the sea of men in suits, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not opportunity, not luck. Something quieter, more dangerous. The sense that his life had just shifted, even if he didn't yet know in which direction. When he finished his shift and rode the elevator down to the street, the city was dark. Neon lights reflected in puddles left by a passing storm. Ethan pulled out Jake's drawing from his pocket, smoothed its creases with his calloused fingers, and whispered, "One day, kiddo. One day I'll give you more." He didn't know then that the woman in the white suit would be part of that promise. or that her question, unthinkable, impossible, would soon change everything. Ethan's second night on the 15th floor began like the first, quiet, methodical, with the faint echo of keyboards and muted phone calls bleeding through glass walls. He had already settled into a rhythm, learning the unspoken rule of being invisible. The faster and quieter he worked, the less anyone noticed him, and the easier it was to get through the hours without feeling the weight of other people's stares. He kept his head down, mop gliding across the marble, trash bins emptied without sound, glass surfaces wiped until they gleamed. But on this night, fate refused to let him remain invisible. He was in the break room rinsing out his mop bucket when the door opened. He glanced up, and there she was, the woman from the night before, Ava Clark. Even in such a mundane space, she looked entirely out of place. Her white suit jacket was unbuttoned now, revealing a silk blouse beneath. A single diamond stud glinted at her ear, understated but undeniable. Her hair, perfectly styled hours earlier, had loosened just enough to make her look less like an untouchable icon and more like a woman who had worked too long into the evening. Ethan froze, his hands submerged in soapy water, his reflection caught in the steel sink. He expected her to ignore him, to pour coffee or make a call and leave. But instead, she spoke. "You hum when you work," she said casually, her voice smooth yet edged with curiosity. He blinked, caught off guard. "Sorry, habit." She leaned lightly against the counter, folding her arms. "Don't apologize. Most people here don't even breathe too loudly. It's unusual." He went back to wringing out the mop, trying to steady himself. "Guess I didn't know there was a rule book." Her lips curved faintly, almost a smile. "There is. It's just unwritten, and it mostly applies to the people in suits, not the ones who actually keep this place running." The comment surprised him. He glanced at her properly this time, and for the first time their eyes held. Brown and unflinching, hers seemed to search past the surface of him, not dismissing him the way others did. He forced himself to look away, muttering, "I'm just here to do my job." "And you do it well," she said. Her gaze flicked to the gleaming counters, the spotless floor. "Most cleaning staff rush. You don't." Ethan swallowed hard, uncomfortable under the weight of her noticing. "Maybe I don't know how to cut corners." That drew her attention even more. That's rare in this building. There was a pause, a silence filled with things unspoken. Ethan finished rinsing the bucket, trying to ignore the heat rising in his chest. He didn't like being studied. He didn't like the way her voice carried both authority and curiosity, as though she could see him more clearly than he wanted. Finally, he asked, "Do you usually talk to the janitors, or am I just tonight's entertainment?" The words slipped out sharper than he intended. He regretted them instantly, but Ava didn't bristle. Instead, she tilted her head, intrigued. "Number Sherwan. I don't usually talk to janitors. But then, I don't usually notice them humming either." Ethan busied himself with the mop, pushing it back into the bucket. He wanted the conversation to end, but some part of him, the part buried beneath fatigue and pride, wanted it to continue. He hated that he noticed the softness in her tone, the way she wasn't mocking him, wasn't condescending. She straightened, as if preparing to leave, then hesitated. "What's your name?" "Ethan," he said reluctantly. She nodded slowly. "Ethan, I'm Ava." As though he didn't already know. She left then, the door closing softly behind her. Ethan stood in the break room, staring at the bucket of water, his reflection rippling across the surface. He felt unsettled, as though the ground beneath him had shifted a fraction, leaving him unbalanced. That night when he returned home, Jake was still awake, sitting cross-legged on the couch with his stuffed bear in his lap. "Dad, did you have a good day?" he asked, his eyes bright with the kind of faith only children could hold. Ethan hesitated, then ruffled his son's hair. "Yeah, buddy, it was different." He didn't mention the woman in the white suit or the way her eyes had lingered on him. But lying in bed later, staring at the cracked ceiling, he knew he wouldn't forget the conversation. Ava Clark was supposed to be unreachable, another world entirely, and yet she had noticed him. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But the memory of her voice saying his name, Ethan, echoed long after the night went quiet. The following week brought a strange rhythm to Ethan's life. By day, he walked Jake to school, packed his lunch, and reminded him to be brave in class. By evening, he pushed his cart through the pristine halls of Whitmore Tower, invisible among the suits and briefcases. And yet, ever since that break room encounter, Ethan could feel her presence. Ava Clark. Sometimes she passed him in the hall, her heels striking against marble floors, her eyes brushing over him with that unreadable intensity. Other times he caught her reflection in the glass walls of the conference rooms, watching the board with a gaze so sharp it could cut steel. He told himself to ignore it, to keep his head down. She was the CEO. He was the janitor. There was no story to tell. But fate had other plans, and it came in the form of Jake. One afternoon, Ethan had no choice but to bring his son with him to the office. Jake's school had closed early, and the neighbor who sometimes watched him was sick. Ethan knew it broke protocol, but he couldn't leave a 6-year-old alone at home. He prayed no one would notice, tucked Jake into the maintenance closet with a small backpack, crayons, and a snack, and whispered, "Stay quiet, champ. I'll check on you every few minutes." For the first hour, it worked. Jake drew superheroes on scraps of paper while Ethan hurried through his rounds. But children are curious, and Jake was his father's son, restless, stubborn, unwilling to be confined. The moment Ethan turned his back to clean a glass wall, Jake slipped out of the closet, wandering down the hall in his little sneakers, his wide blue eyes drinking in the strange world of grown-ups in suits. When Ethan realized his son was gone, panic gripped him. He abandoned the mop and bolted down the corridor, his voice low and urgent. "Jake! Jake, where are you?" The thought of losing him in the labyrinth of this tower made his chest tighten. He turned the corner and froze. There in the center of the polished lobby of the executive floor stood Jake, his small hands tugging gently at the sleeve of a white suit. Ava looked down at him, surprise flickering in her brown eyes. Executives and assistants passing by slowed, curious whispering. The contrast was jarring, the billionaire CEO and the small boy who barely reached her hip. Ethan's heart dropped. He started forward, ready to scoop his son away, when he heard Jake's voice, clear, innocent, and devastating. "Can you be my mom?" The words cracked the air like glass breaking. Ava blinked, taken aback, her lips parting slightly. A flush of color touched her cheeks. The bystanders froze, their curiosity sharpening. And Ethan felt like the floor had been ripped from under him. "Jake!" His voice thundered louder than he intended, carrying down the corridor. He rushed forward, scooping his son into his arms, his grip protective, almost desperate. "You can't just say things like that." Jake looked confused, his small brow furrowed. "But Dad, I don't have one." "And she looks like she could be." The sting of those words pierced Ethan's chest. He could see the sadness in his boy's eyes, the longing he tried so hard to hide. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. "I'm sorry," he muttered quickly to Ava, unable to meet her gaze. "He doesn't understand. I'll keep him out of your way." But Ava's voice stopped him. "Wait." Ethan turned reluctantly. She had crouched down so her eyes were level with Jake's. The hard, polished aura of the CEO was gone. In its place was something softer, something Ethan had never seen in her before. "That's a very important question," she said gently. "Being a mom isn't something you can do halfway. What would I need to do if I was your mom?" Jake tilted his head thinking. His voice was quiet but steady. "You'd sit with me at school tomorrow. We're having muffins with moms. All the kids get to bring their moms, but I don't have one. Dads can't go. I don't want to be alone." A hush fell over the corridor. Even the assistants standing nearby lowered their eyes, moved by the child's honesty. Ava's gaze flicked briefly to Ethan, searching his face, then back to Jake. "Well," she said softly, "if your dad agrees, I could be your mom for a day." Jake's face lit up, his grin wide and unguarded. Ethan, however, felt his stomach twist. "That's not," he began, his voice sharp, defensive. He couldn't bear the thought of Jake getting his hopes up, only to be crushed when reality intruded. But Ava rose gracefully, her eyes locking on his. There was no mockery there, no pity, only sincerity. "Think about it," she said quietly. "It's just one day." She walked away then, her heels clicking softly, leaving father and son in stunned silence. That night, Ethan tucked Jake into bed, the boy clutching his stuffed bear with unusual fierceness. "Dad," he whispered sleepily, "do you think she meant it? Do you think she'll come?" Ethan sat in the dark, his chest heavy. I don't know, buddy. Don't get your hopes too high. But as he lay awake hours later, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't banish the image from his mind. Ava Clark, the untouchable CEO, kneeling before his son, promising to be his mother for a day. It made no sense. It shouldn't have happened. And yet, for the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. The morning of the school event arrived with an anxious weight that pressed on Ethan's chest from the moment his alarm went off. He had been dreading this day ever since Jake first mentioned it, long before Ava ever stepped into the picture. Muffins with moms, even the name felt like a cruel reminder of what Jake didn't have. Ethan had tried to prepare himself for weeks, rehearsing explanations, excuses, ways to soften the disappointment when Jake sat alone at his table, while his classmates basked in the glow of their mother's affection. He had even considered baking muffins himself to bring along, though he knew he wouldn't be allowed to sit in. Fathers weren't part of the tradition. That exclusion stung more than he wanted to admit. The apartment that morning was tense. Ethan shuffled in the kitchen, attempting pancakes on a pan that had seen better days, while Jake sat at the small table, swinging his legs and poking at his food without appetite. The boy was quiet, too quiet, his eyes fixed on the cartoon on TV but not really watching. Ethan hated that look, the hollow anticipation of disappointment. You know, buddy, Ethan said gently, sliding a plate onto the table. It's okay if you don't want to go today. We can have our own muffins here, just you and me. Jake shook his head, his little shoulders stiff. Everyone else is bringing their mom. I don't want to be the only one sitting alone. The words cut deep, sharper than any insult or hardship Ethan had ever endured. He crouched down, resting his hand on his son's back. You're never alone, Jake. Not as long as I'm around. Jake looked up at him with pleading eyes. But they won't let you come. And that was the truth of it. Ethan could fix engines, lift heavy loads, survive long days of labor, but he couldn't fix this. He couldn't give his son the one thing he wanted most. By the time they left the apartment, Ethan's heart was heavy. He drove in silence, Jake sitting quietly in the back seat, clutching his backpack like a shield. The elementary school came into view, bright banners fluttering, parents already streaming inside with boxes of baked goods and paper cups of juice. The parking lot buzzed with laughter and chatter. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He thought about turning around, telling Jake they'd skip it, that no one would notice. But Jake's small voice from the back seat stopped him. Dad, what if she really comes? Ethan swallowed hard. Don't get your hopes up, champ. And then he saw it. A white sedan pulled smoothly into the lot, gleaming in the morning sun. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Ava Clark. She looked striking as always, her tailored white suit sharp against the bright sky. But there was something different about her today. She wasn't flanked by assistants, wasn't carrying a phone pressed to her ear. Instead, she carried a simple bakery box, tied with a ribbon, and her brown eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Jake. The boy gasped, his entire face lighting up. She came, he shouted, scrambling out of the car before Ethan could stop him. He ran across the lot, his backpack bouncing, and threw himself into Ava's arms. She bent down, holding him close with a smile that was both tender and unguarded. Ethan climbed out slowly, disbelief etched into every line of his face. He approached them cautiously, feeling out of place in his faded jeans and worn boots. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly, his voice tight. Yes, Ava replied softly, her eyes never leaving Jake's beaming face. I did. Inside the school, the cafeteria was transformed into a makeshift celebration. Long tables were covered with pastel cloths, muffins and cupcakes piled high. Children pulled their mothers from table to table, showing off their artwork displayed on the walls. The air was thick with laughter and sugar. Ethan lingered near the back, uneasy, feeling like a trespasser. But Ava guided Jake through the crowd with a natural ease that surprised him. She knelt to admire his crayon drawings taped to the wall, asked questions about his favorite books, listened intently when he explained a science project. To Jake, she wasn't a CEO, wasn't a stranger in an immaculate suit. She was simply someone who cared. When the teacher called for everyone to sit, Ava settled beside Jake at the small round table, opening the bakery box to reveal neat rows of muffins dusted with sugar. Jake beamed with pride as he offered them to his classmates, announcing, My mom for a day brought these. The other children accepted them eagerly, and for once, Jake wasn't the boy without a mother. He was just another kid, glowing in the moment. Ethan stood against the wall, watching it all unfold. He saw Jake's smile widen as the teacher took a picture of each child with their mom. When it was Jake's turn, Ava placed an arm gently around his shoulders, and Jake leaned into her without hesitation. The camera flashed, capturing something Ethan knew his son would treasure forever. But what struck him most wasn't Jake's joy. It was the look on Ava's face. For the first time, her polished, composed mask slipped. Her eyes glistened with something raw, something almost painful, as though she understood the weight of what she was giving. She wasn't playing a role. She wasn't pretending. She meant it. After the event ended, the crowd filtered out, and the cafeteria returned to silence. Jake skipped ahead, chattering about his friends, his voice full of life. Ava lingered near Ethan, her gaze steady. "You gave him something today he'll never forget," Ethan said gruffly, his throat thick. Her reply was quiet but firm. "So did you. You've given him everything you could, even when it wasn't enough. Today was just my turn." Ethan searched her face, trying to understand why she had done this. She was a woman with power, wealth, and a world of responsibilities. Yet she had shown up for his son as if nothing else mattered. It unsettled him, frightened him even, because it hinted at something he didn't know how to accept: sincerity. As they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Jake ran ahead toward the playground laughing. Ava glanced at Ethan. "You think I came here for him," she said quietly. "But the truth is, I came here for both of you." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His heart was too tangled, his pride too raw. But as he watched her walk toward Jake, her white suit bright against the playground colors, he knew his world had shifted again. And no matter how much he resisted, Ava Clark was no longer just the CEO in the white suit. She was becoming something far more dangerous to his guarded heart. The weeks after the school event carried a strange new warmth into Ethan's life. Jake talked endlessly about Ava, about the muffins, about the way she had held his hand as if she belonged there. Every evening, Ethan tried to temper the boy's excitement, reminding him gently that Ava was busy, that she had a company to run, that she wasn't really his mom. But even as he said the words, Ethan knew he was lying to himself as much as to his son. Because when Ava appeared in the office halls, offering him a small nod or pausing to ask how Jake was doing, the walls Ethan had built around his heart began to crack. It was in those cracks that danger seeped in. Unbeknownst to Ethan, others had noticed the CEO's unusual attention toward the janitor. Among them was Mark Benson, a senior manager who had been clawing for a place closer to Ava's chair for years. He despised her cool composure, despised the way she never seemed to break under pressure, and most of all, despised the fact that she ignored him. Watching her spare even a shred of attention for a man who scrubbed floors lit a fire of fury inside him. Mark began quietly, a comment here, a whisper there. He told fellow managers he had concerns about Ethan, that something about the janitor seemed off. He spread rumors that Ethan had a criminal record, that Ava was too blind to see she was being manipulated. Within weeks, whispers turned into suspicion. And suspicion is a powerful seed in a corporate building where reputation is currency. Ethan didn't know any of this until the night he walked into the storage closet and found a small envelope tucked beneath his cart. Inside were a few crumpled bills and a sticky note with the words, "Saw you taking supplies. I thought this might help cover it." His chest went cold. He had taken nothing, but the setup was obvious. He shoved the envelope back onto the shelf, disgust twisting his gut, and marched straight to his supervisor. But when he explained, his supervisor's face was tight with unease. "Ethan, look, these things don't just appear. People have been saying you've been—" He hesitated. "Borrowing." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's a lie. You know I'd never steal from this place." The supervisor's silence was answer enough. Trust was gone, replaced with doubt. 2 days later, Mark escalated. During a routine check, the finance department flagged irregularities. False cleaning invoices filed under Ethan's name. Hundreds of dollars supposedly billed for extra hours and supplies. Ethan was called into HR, where stiff-faced men and women asked him questions that felt less like inquiry and more like accusation. He insisted he had done nothing, but his words bounced off their skepticism like stones on glass. By the end of the week, Ethan was summoned to the top floor. Ava wasn't there. Only Mark and two board members. They told him his services were no longer needed. His badge was deactivated. His last paycheck would arrive in the mail. Ethan walked out of Whitmore Tower carrying nothing but the memory of polished floors and the ghost of Ava's gaze. His pride was shattered, his anger burning hot. He thought of Jake's smile at the school event, of the way Ava had crouched to meet his son's eyes, and the ache of humiliation twisted even deeper. He had failed again, not just as a worker, but as a father who promised to keep their fragile world steady. When he returned home that night, Jake ran to him, full of questions. "Dad, did Miss Ava ask about me? Did she say when she's coming again?" Ethan couldn't answer. He sank into the couch, his face buried in his hands, while Jake's voice faded into worried silence. But the cruelty of the setup didn't end there. The next morning, Ethan awoke to messages on his phone. Former clients, neighbors, even the landlord had seen the posts online. Anonymous comments accusing him of theft, painting him as a scammer who preyed on sympathy. Someone had leaked his firing, twisting it into a narrative of guilt. The whispers Mark had seeded had blossomed into full-blown poison. By midday, Ethan could barely breathe under the weight of it. He paced the apartment, fists clenched, every fiber of him screaming to fight back. But how does a janitor fight a machine built to destroy reputations? That evening, as he stared out the window at the city lights, Jake climbed onto the couch beside him. The boy pressed his small hand into his father's larger one, his voice quiet but steady. "Dad, it's okay. You'll fix it. You always fix things." The innocence of the words tore at Ethan's heart. He could fix engines, fix broken locks, fix leaky faucets. But how could he fix this? He didn't know that far above, in her glass office, Ava had already begun to notice the cracks in the story. She had seen the falsified invoices, the conveniently timed discoveries, the smug gleam in Mark's eyes. And unlike the rest of the board, she wasn't so quick to believe. But Ethan didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he had been stripped of the one shred of stability he had clawed together, and his son was watching him try not to break. That night, lying awake in the dark, Ethan whispered to himself the promise he had made 100 times before. "I won't give up. Not for him." And though his pride was bleeding and his heart was heavy, a storm was building inside him, a storm that would not stay silent for long. Ava Clark had built her empire on numbers, details, and the certainty that truth, when examined under a microscope, always revealed itself. Lies had a way of fraying at the edges, no matter how carefully they were woven. And from the moment she was told that Ethan Moore had been fired for theft, something in her instincts whispered that the story was rotten. She had seen Ethan's eyes when he worked, the quiet dignity in his movements, the pride he took in even the smallest tasks. He was not a man who cut corners. He was not a man who stole. The night after his dismissal, Ava stayed late in her office, the tower emptying out around her. Outside, the city glittered in cold streams of neon. But inside her glass-walled sanctuary, only the low hum of her laptop and the ticking of the clock kept her company. She pulled up the financial reports, scrolling through invoices with surgical precision. The falsified ones were there, filed under Ethan's name, signed with a shaky imitation of his signature. To anyone glancing quickly, they looked legitimate. But Ava had studied people too long to miss the small tells. The handwriting slanted differently. The timestamp entered seconds apart in a way no real work order ever would. Her suspicion crystallized into certainty. Someone had set him up. But who? The answer came in fragments. A poorly hidden smirk in a meeting, a careless slip of a tongue in the hallway. Mark Benson. He had been circling her position for years, undermining her with subtle sabotage, always too cautious to cross the line outright. But this was his boldest play. Destroying a man who had caught her attention was his way of reminding her that she was not untouchable. Ava leaned back in her chair, her reflection staring back at her in the black glass window. She thought of Jake, his small face lighting up when she'd knelt in front of him, the tremor in his voice when he'd asked if she could be his mom for a day. She thought of Ethan's tight, guarded expression, the way his eyes had burned with humiliation when he apologized for his son's question. And she thought of the way he had been fired, without her presence, without her word, as though her authority had been circumvented. Numbered as she would not allow it. The next morning, Ava summoned her head of compliance, a meticulous woman named Carla, with sharp glasses and a sharper mind, appeared in her office. Ava handed her the falsified invoices. Trace every login, every keystroke, quietly. I want to know exactly who entered these into the system and when. Carla nodded. And if I find what I think you already know, then we let the truth speak for itself, Ava replied. Days passed, and Ava carried on her CEO duties with her usual poise. But behind the calm mask, her resolve simmered. Every evening she checked in with Carla. Every evening, the net tightened. And finally, one Thursday night, Carla entered with a flash drive and a thin smile. We have him, Benson. He used a proxy account, but he slipped. Logged in once from his personal laptop. Time-stamped, geotagged. We've got screenshots, security footage, even a receipt of the office supply order he used as a cover. It's ironclad. Ava exhaled slowly, relief and fury colliding in her chest. Good. Tomorrow we make it public. And public it was. The next morning, Ava called an emergency meeting of the senior staff. Executives filed in, whispering among themselves. Mark Benson striding in with false confidence. He sat near the head of the table, ready to spin whatever narrative suited him. But when Ava entered, she didn't sit. She remained standing, her presence commanding immediate silence. In the past week, she began, her voice even but laced with steel, this company has witnessed a man's livelihood destroyed by lies. A father, a worker, someone who carried out his duties with honor, was smeared and cast aside. That man was Ethan Moore. And this morning, I will set the record straight. Murmurs rippled across the table. Mark shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Ava gestured to Carla, who dimmed the lights and projected the evidence onto the screen. Login records, timestamps, surveillance footage of Mark entering the finance office late at night. The falsified invoices pulled apart line by line, signatures compared, flaws magnified. The room grew colder by the minute. Finally, Ava turned to Mark, her gaze unflinching. Would you like to explain why your laptop was used to frame an innocent man? Mark blanched, sweat breaking across his temple. He sputtered excuses, muttering about being set up, about technical errors. But the evidence was overwhelming, and every executive in the room could see it. His words collapsed into stammers, his arrogance shriveling. Ava straightened, her voice firm enough to echo in the glass walls. Effective immediately, Mark Benson is terminated. Legal action will follow. Let it be clear, in this company, deceit is a fire, and I will not let it burn the innocent. The meeting ended in stunned silence. Mark was escorted out, his protest useless. Later that evening, Ava left the tower and drove not to her penthouse, but to a modest neighborhood across town. She parked in front of a small apartment building, climbed the worn stairs, and knocked on Ethan's door. When he opened it, his expression was wary, his shoulders tense. Jake peeked out from behind him, his eyes brightening at the sight of her. "Miss Ava!" the boy exclaimed, rushing forward. She crouched, hugging him tightly before rising to meet Ethan's guarded gaze. "You didn't do it," she said simply. "I proved it." Ethan blinked, his jaw working. "What are you talking about?" She handed him a folder. Inside were copies of the evidence, neatly organized. "You were framed by one of my managers. He's gone now. Everyone knows the truth." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. His hand tightened on the folder, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice low, almost raw. "Why would you fight for me? You could have ignored it. You could have let me take the fall." Ava's eyes softened. "Because I saw you, long before this. I saw the way you worked, the way you carried yourself. And because your son deserves to believe his father is the man he knows him to be." Jake tugged at Ethan's hand, looking up with wide, trusting eyes. "See, Dad? I told you she wouldn't let you down." Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to cling to his pride, to keep the walls up. But the truth was undeniable. She had fought for him when no one else would. And in that moment, as Ava stood in his small apartment, her white suit stark against the peeling paint of the walls, Ethan realized that the gulf between their worlds wasn't as insurmountable as he had believed. Because she wasn't just a CEO, and he wasn't just a janitor. They were two people who had chosen to stand in the fire, and somehow, together, they hadn't burned. The days after Benson's downfall were strange for Ethan. The whispers about him that had once poisoned the halls of Whitmore Tower were silenced, replaced with murmurs of sympathy and shock. His name had been cleared, but vindication didn't erase the humiliation, nor the memory of being walked out of the building as if he were guilty. He tried to move forward to focus on Jake and on finding new work. But the truth was simple. Doors didn't open easily for men with records of dismissal, no matter the reason. Pride gnawed at him. He hated relying on anyone. And yet Ava had stepped into the fire for him, tearing apart her own management team to prove his innocence. That debt sat heavy on his chest, heavier even than the guilt of not being enough for his son. One evening, a week after the scandal, Ava invited Ethan and Jake to her penthouse. He had refused twice before, insisting that it wasn't his world, that Jake didn't need to see such extravagance. But Jake's pleading had worn him down. Jake wanted to see where Miss Ava lived, wanted to climb the tall building that gleamed like a lighthouse over the city. So, reluctantly, Ethan agreed. When they arrived, Ava opened the door herself. She wore no suit this time, just a simple cream blouse and dark jeans, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. The penthouse was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the skyline like a painting, polished wood floors, shelves lined with books and framed photographs. But what caught Ethan off guard wasn't the luxury, it was the warmth. It wasn't a showroom, sterile and cold. It was a home. A vase of fresh flowers stood on the table. A half-finished puzzle sat on the coffee table. A kitchen towel was draped over the counter as though she'd just been baking. Jake darted forward, pressing his face to the glass, marveling at the tiny cars below. Ava smiled, kneeling beside him to point out landmarks in the distance. Ethan hung back, feeling out of place, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "You don't have to be uncomfortable," Ava said softly, approaching him. "This isn't about the view, it's about sharing space." Ethan gave a short laugh, rough and skeptical. "Sharing space with you means walking through a world that doesn't belong to me?" She tilted her head. "Maybe the world isn't about belonging. Maybe it's about building something new." Later, when Jake grew tired and fell asleep curled up on the couch with her throw blanket, Ava poured 2 glasses of wine and motioned for Ethan to join her on the balcony. The city stretched endlessly around them, lights flickering like stars. For a while, they stood in silence, the cool night air brushing against them. "You know," Ava said finally, her voice steady but quieter than usual, "people think power makes you invincible. They think money solves loneliness. But when I was a child, all I wanted was someone to choose me. Not for what I could become, but for who I was. No one ever did." She paused, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Until your son looked at me and asked me to be his mom for a day." Ethan turned toward her, his chest tightening. "He's just a kid. He doesn't know the weight of words like that." "But I do," she whispered, "and it broke me in the best possible way." Ethan said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. He had seen her command boardrooms, dismantle lies, stand against men twice her size without blinking. But here, under the glow of the city, she looked fragile in a way that shook him. Finally, she turned to him fully, her brown eyes locking onto his. "Ethan, if I asked you to marry me, would you?" The question hit him like a blow. His body stiffened, his breath catching. He searched her face, expecting a smirk, a sign of jest. But there was none. She was deadly serious, her expression open but firm, the question not born of impulse but of decision. "You can't be serious," he said at last, his voice hoarse. "I've never been more serious," she replied. "I don't want a business partner. I don't want another executive by my side. I want someone real, someone who doesn't care about my money, who doesn't bend when life tries to break him. That's you, Ethan. That's who you've been since the moment I first saw you cleaning glass like it mattered." He shook his head, backing a step away. "I'm a janitor. I've got nothing. No house, no savings, no future to hand you. You're a billionaire CEO. If people heard you say this, they'd laugh you out of the room." Her voice sharpened, cutting through his doubts. "I don't care what they think. Let them laugh. I don't need another deal to impress a boardroom. I need someone I can trust when the lights are off and the city goes quiet. I need you." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides, his chest heaving. He thought of Jake asleep inside, of the look on his son's face at the school event, of the hope that had blossomed in him after years of absence. He thought of every time he had been told he wasn't enough, and every time he had believed it. And now here was this woman with everything asking for him. Of all people, he wanted to say yes. God, he wanted to, but fear strangled him. Fear of being swallowed by her world, of becoming a story she told at parties. The janitor I married to feel grounded. He couldn't risk Jake's heart on a promise he didn't understand. You don't know what you're asking, he said finally, his voice ragged. Marriage isn't a game. I can't be the man who takes what you're offering and then watches it all collapse. I can't put Jake through that. Ava stepped closer, closing the space between them, her voice low but unwavering. You're right. It isn't a game. That's why I'm asking. Because I know what I want. And I think, deep down, you do too. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. He could smell the faint trace of her perfume, feel the warmth of her presence. He had never been more torn in his life. Finally, he whispered, I need time. Ava nodded once, her face unreadable. Take it, but don't take too long. Life doesn't wait forever. She turned back toward the glass door, leaving him alone with the city spread out beneath his feet, his soul caught between fear and longing. Inside, Jake stirred in his sleep, clutching the blanket tighter. Ethan watched him through the glass, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it would mean if he said yes. Not just for him, but for his son. And the thought terrified him more than anything else. Rain swept across the city the night Ethan made his decision. It wasn't the soft drizzle that kissed windows and lulled children to sleep. It was a heavy, relentless storm that battered the streets and hammered on rooftops, like the world itself was restless. Ethan sat at the kitchen table of his apartment, staring at a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. Jake was asleep in the bedroom, clutching his stuffed bear the way he always did when the weather turned rough. The boy had asked about Ava before bed, asked if she would come again, if she would still be his mom for a day. Ethan hadn't known how to answer. He was a man of grit and labor, not promises he couldn't keep. But tonight he realized silence was its own kind of lie. The memory of Ava's voice on the balcony replayed over and over. If I asked you to marry me, would you? The certainty in her eyes, the way she hadn't flinched when he spoke of his failures, haunted him. He had thought of all the reasons to walk away. Pride, fear, the enormous gulf between their worlds. But every reason fell apart when he pictured Jake's face at the school event. His son's joy when Ava sat beside him like she had always belonged there. For years, Ethan had tried to be enough on his own, carrying the weight of two parents on his shoulders. But maybe strength wasn't about carrying everything alone. Maybe strength was letting someone else carry a piece of it with you. By morning, his mind was made up. He woke Jake early, bundled him in a jacket, and they took the subway into the heart of the city. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that mirrored the rising sun, and the streets glistened with fresh clarity. Whitmore Tower loomed ahead, all steel and glass, intimidating as ever. But this time, Ethan didn't feel like a ghost in its halls. He felt like a man walking toward the truth. The receptionist blinked in surprise when he asked to see Ava. She's in a meeting, she said nervously. Ethan simply nodded. Tell her Ethan Moore is here, and that it's important. 15 minutes later, the boardroom doors opened and Ava stepped out. She was in her signature white suit, her hair tied back, her expression unreadable. Executives murmured behind her, glancing curiously at the janitor standing tall in the lobby with a boy at his side. But Ava ignored them all. Her eyes locked on Ethan, and for a moment, the noise of the world fell away. You shouldn't be here without an appointment, she said, though her voice lacked the steel it usually carried. I know, Ethan replied, his tone steady. He reached for Jake's hand, pulling him gently forward. But I needed you to hear this. Both of you did. Jake looked up at Ava, his eyes wide, uncertain. Ethan crouched so he was level with his son. Buddy, you asked Miss Ava if she could be your mom for a day. Do you remember that? Jake nodded shyly. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. Well, I think it's time we asked her to stay a little longer, not just for a day, for good. A hush fell over the lobby. Ava's lips parted, her composure slipping, shock flashing across her features. For a woman who had mastered the art of never being caught off guard, the vulnerability in her eyes was staggering. Ethan rose, stepping closer. His voice was rough but clear. You asked me a question on that balcony, and I didn't answer because I was afraid. Afraid I'd lose myself, afraid I wasn't enough, afraid of what people would say. But I realized something. I've already lost everything before. Jobs, respect, security, and I survived. The only thing I can't lose is him. He nodded toward Jake. And I can't ignore what he feels. Or what I feel. So, yes, Ava. If you still want a man like me, the answer is yes. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching taut like a bowstring. Then Ava's eyes filled with tears. Not the restrained, hidden kind, but tears she didn't bother to stop. She crossed the distance between them in quick strides, her hand reaching for his. I don't want a man like you, Ethan, she said, her voice breaking. I want you. Jake squealed, wrapping his arms around both of them, his small body pressed between theirs. The lobby erupted in murmurs, executives whispering, assistants blinking in disbelief. The CEO of Whitmore Mobility, the untouchable billionaire in her pristine white suit, stood holding hands with a janitor and his son, tears shining in her eyes. It was a scene that shattered every rule of their world. Later that evening, the three of them sat in Ava's penthouse, the skyline glowing like 1,000 candles around them. Jake was sprawled on the couch, asleep under a blanket, his face peaceful in a way Ethan hadn't seen in years. Ava poured them both tea, her hands steady now, her composure restored, though her eyes still glistened with the afterglow of emotion. You know this won't be easy, Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. People will talk. They'll question you, mock me. They'll say I'm just here for your money. Let them, Ava replied firmly. She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. I built a company from the ground up. I can handle whispers. What I can't handle is living another day without the chance to choose what I want. And what I want is this. You, Jake. A family. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting from his chest. For the first time, the word didn't feel foreign. Family. That night, as the city pulsed outside their window, Ethan lay awake with Jake curled against his side and Ava resting near him, her presence steady and sure. He thought of every hardship, every humiliation, every night he had gone to bed believing he wasn't enough. And then he looked at them, his son, his partner, and realized those nights were over. The janitor and the CEO. The boy who wanted a mom for a day and ended up with a mother forever. It sounded impossible, a story out of place in a world built on hierarchies and walls. But here, in the quiet of the storm's aftermath, it was real. And for Ethan Moore, that was more shocking, more humbling, and more beautiful than anything money could ever buy. My take on the ending is that it lands exactly where it needs to, not in the glitter of wealth or the power of corporate towers, but in the small, deeply human victory of love and belonging. The story starts with a man at his lowest point, a janitor who feels invisible, who thinks he has nothing left to offer except his perseverance for the sake of his son. By the end, he discovers that the very things he thought made him unworthy, his humility, his honesty, his refusal to quit, are what make him invaluable. What I especially like is how the mom for a day moment, which could have been nothing more than a child's innocent wish, grows into the soul of the entire story. That one question exposes wounds in both Ethan and Ava, his fear of never giving his son enough, and her loneliness as a powerful woman who has everything but the family she longed for. By the time the story closes, that question is answered not with pity or pretense, but with commitment. The shock value works too, not in the sense of scandal, but in the reversal of expectation. A billionaire CEO isn't supposed to fall for a janitor. A janitor isn't supposed to turn down the idea of wealth because of pride and fear. A child isn't supposed to change the trajectory of two adults' lives with one request. And yet all of those not supposed to moments are what make the ending so satisfying. In the end, the lesson I draw is that love isn't about status, money, or appearances. It's about courage. The courage to say yes when life offers you something terrifying but real. And in a world where too many stories end in loss, this one reminds us that sometimes the most shocking outcome is also the simplest. A family, finally complete,